The sky over the Henan province of China in that sweltering January of 1945 seemed bleached of all color by relentless heat and swirling yellow dust. Major Yasuhiko Kuroe stood at the edge of the Suchao airfield's runway, his eyes narrowed against the acrid sting of his own cigarette smoke. His face, etched with the deep lines of premature exhaustion, was a mask of practiced calm, yet a strange, gnawing premonition stirred within him. The war, which had once felt like a series of brilliant lightning strikes, had transformed into a long, agonizing march toward a precipice. The drone of the engine arrived without warning. It was not the high-pitched, strained whine of the Japanese Nakajima power plants he knew so well. This was a deep, guttural bass, a mechanical roar that made the very earth vibrate beneath the soles of his boots. Soldiers across the airfield froze in their tracks. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their positions, cranking the barrels of their guns toward the horizon, but no order to fire was given. From the west, skimming low over the tops of the withered, scrubby trees, came a lone aircraft. Its polished aluminum skin flashed with such blinding intensity under the midday sun that it was painful to behold. The plane approached unevenly, its tail twitching slightly in the turbulence, and its landing gear had been cycled down far too early. It was a Mustang. The silver ghost the Japanese pilots whispered about in their darkened canteens, calling it the invisible death. But this particular machine was not looking for a kill. It was coming home to an enemy nest. Kuroe watched as the heavy machine flared for landing. Dust erupted in a massive orange cloud as the tires slammed into the uneven soil. The aircraft bounced once, then twice, before rolling heavily toward the hangars, swaying on its struts like a wounded predator. The propeller made several more lazy, silver revolutions before coming to a dead halt. The silence that followed the death of that mighty Merlin engine was almost deafening. Yasuhiko was the first to move toward the machine, waving away the frantic soldiers who approached with fixed bayonets. He wanted to see this marvel of engineering before it was defiled by clumsy hands or ruined by an unskilled interrogation of its pilot. From the cockpit, the canopy sliding back with a smooth hydraulic hiss, emerged a man in a worn leather flight jacket. It was Second Lieutenant Oliver Strawbridge. He looked absurdly young, barely a boy, his face smeared with a thick layer of soot, grease, and sweat. His eyes darted nervously across the rows of bayonets, but there was no submission in his posture, only a profound, soul-deep disappointment. He jumped down to the wing and then to the ground, his hands raised in a gesture of weary surrender. But Kuroe did not look at the prisoner. His gaze was locked onto the nose of the fighter. There, just below the blackened exhaust stacks, was a masterfully painted pin-up girl in a provocative pose, and beside her, written in elegant, flowing script, was a name: Evalina. Evalina, the major murmured to himself, testing the foreign vowels on his tongue. It sounded soft, like the rustle of silk, and felt entirely at odds with this formidable weapon of war. Yasuhiko stepped closer and ran his hand along the leading edge of the wing. He had expected the roughness of matte paint or the fragile give of the doped fabric he was accustomed to on his own Key 43 Oscars. Instead, his fingers met cold, impossibly smooth metal. The rivets were driven so flush and so true that they felt like part of the very grain of the wing itself. This was not merely a machine. It was a testament to the industrial soul of a nation that could afford to polish its killers to a mirror finish, even in the midst of a global slaughter. Mechanics were already swarming the aircraft, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and greed. One of the lead engineers pointed to the belly of the beast. The radiator had been nicked by a single, lucky rifle round from the ground, a tiny piece of lead that had brought this titan to its knees. A thin, iridescent stream of coolant was still dripping onto the parched Chinese earth. "Major," the engineer whispered, his voice trembling with a feverish excitement. "It is a Charlie model, the latest version. The damage is superficial. If we can patch the core, she will fly again." Kuroe nodded in silence. He felt a strange electric tremor in his chest. A plan was already forming in his mind, one that bordered on treasonous curiosity. He did not want to simply strip this plane for parts or ship it back to a laboratory in Tokyo. He wanted to break it, He wanted to tame this silver beast and feel the raw, unbridled power that allowed the Americans to claim the very sun as their own. That evening, as Strawbridge was led away for questioning, Kuroe sat alone in the cockpit of the captured fighter. The interior smelled of rich leather, high-grade oil, and the sweet, intoxicating scent of high-octane aviation gasoline, a fuel the Imperial Army had not seen in over a year. The instruments were encased in non-reflective glass, and the seat was backed by a heavy plate of real armor steel, a luxury Japan had long ago abandoned in the desperate pursuit of maneuverability. Yasuhiko rested his palms on the control stick. It felt heavy, solid, and utterly responsive. In that moment, he realized his life had been severed into two distinct halves. The Evalina was now his obsession. He would learn her secrets, he would master her spirit, and perhaps, within her steel heart, he would find the answer to the question he dared not ask aloud. Did Japan have even a shadow of a chance to survive the coming storm? The sun had barely begun to bleed over the eastern horizon when the mechanics finished their frantic work. For 3 days and 3 nights, they had labored under the dim glow of hanging lanterns, their fingers stained with the strange blue-tinted fluids of American origin. They had patched the radiator with a precision born of desperation, terrified that even a single loose screw might offend the silver god now occupying their hangar. Major Yasuhiko Kuroe stood by the open hangar doors, his flight suit zipped tight against the morning chill, watching the ground crew tow the Mustang out onto the dusty runway. A small crowd of pilots had gathered at a respectful distance. They were the survivors of dozens of air battles, men who flew the nimble but fragile Hayabusas and Zeros. To them, the Evalina looked like something forged in a different century. Its laminar flow wings were thin and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, and the massive four-bladed propeller seemed large enough to pull the entire airfield into the sky. Kuroe climbed onto the wing, his boots making a dull, solid thud against the aluminum. He felt a surge of adrenaline that he hadn't experienced since his first solo flight as a cadet. As he lowered himself into the cockpit, he was once again struck by the sheer ergonomics of the American design. Everything was where it should be. The throttle lever fit his palm perfectly. The rudder pedals were adjustable to the inch. It was a cockpit designed not just to house a pilot, but to preserve him. "Clear!" he shouted in English, a small smirk playing on his lips as he used the enemy's tongue. He engaged the electric starter. In a Japanese plane, this would have involved a frantic choreography of hand cranking and shouting. Here, it was the simple flick of a switch. The starter whined, a high-pitched mechanical scream that lasted for 5 seconds before the Merlin engine caught. A massive cloud of blue smoke erupted from the exhaust stacks, followed by a sound that silenced every other noise in the province. It was a rhythmic, thundering gallop, the sound of 1,500 horses being unleashed at once. Kuroe taxied to the end of the runway, feeling the immense torque of the engine trying to pull the nose to the left. He checked his gauges. The needles were steady, the temperatures rising with mathematical precision. He took a deep breath, tasted the metallic tang of his oxygen mask, and shoved the throttle forward. The acceleration was not a gradual increase in speed. It was a violent shove in the small of his back. The Evalina roared, her tail lifting off the ground almost immediately. The dust of Suchow became a blurred streak beneath him, and before he could even register the transition, the vibration of the earth vanished. He was airborne. "Gear up," he commanded himself, pulling the lever. He heard the reassuring mechanical thunk of the wheels locking into the wells. He didn't just climb, he soared. In his Nakajima, reaching 5,000 meters was a chore that required patience and careful management of the engine. The Mustang devoured the altitude. 6,000 meters. 7,000. The air outside grew thin and cold, but the cockpit remained sealed and comfortable. Kuroe leveled off and looked around. The world below looked insignificant, a patchwork of brown and gray. Then he began the real test. He pushed the stick over and entered a steep dive. In a Japanese fighter, a dive at this speed would cause the wings to flutter and the fabric to rip away from the frame. The Evalina remained as solid as a block of granite. The airspeed indicators spun past 400 miles per hour, numbers that seemed impossible for a single-engine machine. He pulled out of the dive with a sharp, high-G turn. His vision blurred at the edges as the centrifugal force pressed him into his seat, but the controls did not stiffen. The hydraulic boost kept the stick light and responsive. He felt like a god wielding a lightning bolt. He performed a victory roll, then a loop, laughing aloud inside his mask. The sheer mechanical competence of the aircraft was intoxicating. But as the initial euphoria began to fade, a cold, hollow sensation took its place in his gut. He looked at the fuel gauge and the ammunition counters. He thought about the thousands of Mustangs currently rolling off assembly lines in places like California and Texas. He thought about the young American boys like Strawbridge who were being handed these masterpieces of technology after only a few hundred hours of training. Japan's victory had always been predicated on the superior spirit of its warriors, the idea that the Yamato Damashi could overcome any material disadvantage. But as Kuroe pushed the Evalina to its limits, banking hard over the yellow mountains of China, he realized the terrifying truth. The Americans hadn't just built a better machine, they had built a machine that rendered the traditional warrior spirit obsolete. No amount of courage could compensate for a 300-mile-per-hour speed deficit. No samurai code could stop a half-inch caliber bullet fired from a mile away by a pilot who was warm, well-fed, and protected by an inch of steel plate. He looked at the small photo of the girl, Evalina, taped to the instrument panel. She seemed to be smiling at him, a mocking, pitying grin. "You are not a ghost," Kuroe whispered into the roar of the wind. "You are the executioner." He turned the silver nose back toward the airfield. He had found his answer, but it was an answer that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He would fly this plane again. He would teach others how to fight it. But he knew in his heart that he was merely practicing for a funeral. The transfer from the dusty plains of China to the heart of the Japanese Empire was a journey through a dying dream. The Evalina had been partially dismantled, her silver wings crated in seasoned wood, and her mighty engine preserved in thick grease for the long voyage across the sea. Major Yasuhiko Kuroe followed his prize, traveling in the cramped, cold hold of a transport ship that dodged American submarines like a hunted animal. When the crates were finally opened at the Fusa airfield near Tokyo, the damp air of the home island seemed to make the Mustang's skin sweat, as if the machine itself were anxious to be back in the sky. The facility at Fusa was the nerve center of the Army Air Force's experimental wing. Here, the brightest minds of the Empire gathered to dissect the technology of their enemies. But as Kuroe stood on the tarmac, he saw the hollow eyes of the mechanics and the frayed collars of the officers. The shortages were no longer a secret. Even here, at the Elite Evaluation Center, the light bulbs flickered from power surges, and the premium fuel smelled of turpentine and low-grade additives. "You look as though you've seen a ghost, Kuroe," a voice called out. Yasuhiko turned to see Colonel Motoharu Okuyama, a man whose reputation for discipline was matched only by his skepticism of anything foreign. Behind him stood a group of young pilots, the so-called Young Lions of the defense of Tokyo. They wore their white scarves with a bravado that felt brittle, like glass about to shatter. "Not a ghost, Colonel," Kuroe replied, bowing stiffly. "A mirror. I have brought you a mirror in which we can finally see our true faces." Okuyama scoffed, walking around the reassembled Mustang. "It is large, clumsy. It looks like a bathtub with wings. Our Hayate will turn inside this beast before the American pilot can even blink. You have spent too much time in the colonies, Major. You have forgotten the soul of our aviation." Kuroe felt a flash of anger, but he suppressed it. He knew that words were useless against the dogma of the High Command. They still believed in the dogfight, the elegant, swirling dance of man and machine where maneuverability was the only metric of success. They refused to understand that the Americans had changed the rules of the game. "With your permission, Colonel," Kuroe said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. I would like to demonstrate the clumsiness of this bathtub. Select your best pilot. Let us fly a mock engagement this afternoon. Let the men see what they are truly up against." The challenge was accepted with a chorus of arrogant chuckles from the younger pilots. They chose Captain Shimada, a man who had survived the slaughter over the Solomons and now flew the Ki-84 Hayate, the Frank, which was widely considered the finest fighter Japan had ever produced. On paper, the Hayate was a match for anything in the Allied arsenal. It was fast, heavily armed, and retained the legendary agility of its predecessors. As the sun reached its zenith, Kuroe climbed into the cockpit of the Evalina. He felt a strange sense of loyalty to the machine. He had spent his nights reading the translated technical manuals, memorizing every pressure curve and every electrical circuit. He knew that the Mustang was not just a plane, it was a system. He taxied out to the runway, the Merlin engine barking with a ferocity that seemed to offend the quiet Japanese afternoon. Beside him, Shimada's Hayate looked lean and predatory, its camouflage paint blending into the distant green hills. The two planes took off in formation, a silver streak and a dark shadow rising into the hazy blue sky over Tokyo Bay. Thousands of eyes watched from below, mechanics, generals, and office workers who had stopped to look at the strange, shimmering bird in the sky. At 10,000 feet, Kuroe gave the signal. The mock combat was on. Shimada acted instantly. He pulled the Hayate into a tight, climbing turn, attempting to get onto the Mustang's tail. It was a classic move, executed with perfect precision. In a zero, Kuroe would have been forced to dive or break away. But he wasn't in a zero. He slammed the throttle forward to the war emergency power setting. The Mustang surged. He didn't turn with Shimada, he simply climbed. He went vertical, the nose of the Evalina pointing straight at the sun. The Hayate followed, but within seconds the gap began to widen. The American engine simply refused to quit, while the Japanese engine, struggling with inferior spark plugs and poor fuel, began to labor. Kuroe looked back over his shoulder. He saw the Hayate stall out, its nose dropping as it lost the fight against gravity. He was now 2,000 feet above his opponent, holding all the cards. "Now," Kuroe whispered, "the lesson begins." He rolled the Mustang onto its back and dived. The speed built up with terrifying ease. In the cockpit of the Hayate, Shimada must have been frantic, trying to find his enemy in the glare of the sun. Kuroe didn't close in for a close-range turn-and-burn fight. Instead, he utilized the Mustang's greatest gift, energy. He screamed past Shimada at a speed that made the Hayate look as though it were standing still, then used that momentum to zoom back up to a position of safety. It wasn't a dogfight. It was an execution. Again and again, Kuroe killed the best pilot in the Empire without ever putting himself at risk. He was a ghost that could not be touched, a hammer that struck from the heavens and vanished before the blow could be returned. When they finally landed, the silence at Fusa Airfield was different than the silence at Suchow. It was the silence of a realization so painful that no one dared to put it into words. Shimada climbed out of his cockpit, his face pale and his hands trembling. He didn't look at the colonel. He walked straight to the wing of the Mustang and stared at the Evalina nose art. "I could not even see him," Shimada whispered to the gathered officers. "Every time I thought I had him, he was already gone." It is not a plane. It is a curse. Kuroe remained in his cockpit for a long time, watching the needles settle back to zero. He had proven his point, but there was no triumph in his heart. He had shown them the face of their destroyer, and now they all had to live with the knowledge of what was coming. The demonstration at Fusa had acted like a drop of ink in a glass of clear water, staining the confidence of everyone who witnessed it. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at the airfield shifted from arrogant defiance to a grim, funeral-like industriousness. Major Yasuhiko Kuroe became a man isolated by his own expertise. To the high-ranking generals, he was a harbinger of doom they preferred to ignore. To the young pilots, he was the man who had broken their spirit before the Americans even arrived. Seeking an escape from the suffocating tension of the officers' mess, Kuroe found himself drawn to the small, damp concrete cell where Second Lieutenant Oliver Strawbridge was being held. The American had been moved to Tokyo for technical consultation, a polite euphemism for being interrogated by men who didn't understand the machines he flew. Kuroe entered the cell carrying a small tin of high-quality tea and 2 porcelain cups, a luxury that cost him a week's rations on the black market. Strawbridge sat on a wooden cot, looking thinner, his eyes hollowed out by the constant glare of interrogation lamps. He looked up, expecting another session of barked questions. Instead, he saw the man who had stolen his plane. "I flew her today," Kuroe said in his halting but precise English. He sat on a low stool, placing the tea between them. Strawbridge stiffened, his jaw tightening. "Did you crash her? Because if you did, you're the first one. She's a lady. She doesn't like clumsy hands." Kuroe allowed a ghost of a smile to touch his lips. "No crash. She is more than a lady. She is a masterpiece. I have never felt such harmony between man and metal." "You Americans, you do not build planes to fight. You build them to dominate." The American relaxed slightly, the mention of the Mustang acting like a secret password. "She's built by North American Aviation. 5,000 men and women in a factory in Inglewood put their souls into that airframe. It's not just the engine, Major. It's the way she's put together. You can't fight a factory that never sleeps." Kuroe poured the tea, the steam rising in the cold, stagnant air. "That is what my superiors do not understand. They think of war as a duel between 2 samurai. They do not see the shadow of the factory behind the sword. I saw your gauges, Lieutenant, your radio, your oxygen system. Everything is redundant. Everything is designed to bring you home." "That's the point," Strawbridge said, taking the cup with trembling fingers. "We're worth more to the Army alive than dead. Can you say the same for your boys?" The question hung in the air like a heavy curtain. Kuroe thought of the kamikaze units being formed in the South. Young men, some barely 17 years old, being given 5 hours of training and a bomb with wings. He thought of the lack of parachutes in the early Zeros and the missing armor plate in the Hayabusas. "In Japan," Kuroe whispered, looking into the dark leaves at the bottom of his cup, "we are taught that the soul is the only weapon that matters. But I have felt the Merlin engine. I have seen the way your wings do not tremble at 500 miles per hour. A soul cannot stop a .50 caliber bullet." For a moment, the 2 men were no longer enemies. They were 2 aviators caught in the gears of a global machine that cared nothing for their lives. Kuroe reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. It was a sketch he had made of the Evalina nose art, the pinup girl. "Who was she?" Kuroe asked. "The real Evalina?" Strawbridge's eyes softened, a flicker of humanity returning to his weary face. "My sister's best friend, back in Ohio. She promised me a dance when I got back, just one dance at the Harvest Festival." He looked at the sketch, then at Kuroe. "You're going to fly her against us, aren't you? When the B-29s come." Kuroe stood up, the moment of brotherhood dissolving into the harsh reality of his uniform. "I am a soldier of the Emperor. I have a duty to my country, even if I know that country is walking into a fire. But I will tell you this, Lieutenant. When I am in that cockpit, I do not feel like an executioner. I feel like a man trying to hold back the tide with a cup." As Kuroe left the cell, he heard the distant, low-frequency hum of air raid sirens from the city. It was a false alarm, a test, but it served as a reminder. The real Evalinas were coming by the hundreds. They would be escorted by thousands of silver ghosts, all polished to a mirror finish, all flown by boys who expected to go home to Ohio and dance at harvest festivals. He walked back to the hangar where the Evalina sat under a camouflage net. The mechanics were asleep, slumped against the tires. Kuroe climbed onto the wing and sat there in the dark, his hand resting on the cold aluminum. He realized then that he wasn't just studying the plane to find its weaknesses. He was seeking refuge in it. The Mustang was the only thing in Japan that felt solid, the only thing that didn't smell of decay and desperation. He looked up at the stars, wondering which one of them would eventually fall as a burning B-29, and which one would be him, falling in a silver coffin that he had learned to love too late. The spring of 1945 did not bring the scent of cherry blossoms to Tokyo. It brought the smell of scorched earth and ozone. By March, the high-altitude precision bombing had transitioned into something far more terrifying. The Americans had stripped their B-29 superfortresses of their heavy guns, loaded them with thousands of pounds of incendiary gel, and sent them in at low altitudes to turn the wooden heart of Japan into a funeral pyre. Major Yasuhiko Kuroe stood on the tarmac at Fusa, watching the horizon glow with a sickly, pulsing orange light. The capital was burning. Even from 20 miles away, he could feel the ghost of the heat on his cheeks. The Evalina stood behind him, her polished skin reflecting the distant fires like a dark silver mirror. She was no longer a secret evaluation tool. She was one of the few machines left in the district with the engine power to reach the bombers before they vanished back into the safety of the Pacific. "Major, the command is hesitant," Colonel Okuyama said, stepping into the light of the hangar. His uniform was disheveled, and his eyes were bloodshot. "They fear that if you fly the Mustang tonight, our own Shidenkai pilots will mistake you for the enemy. The sky is a chaotic mess of flak and fire." Kuroe didn't look back. He was tightening the straps of his parachute, his fingers moving with a mechanical rhythm. "If I fly a Ki 43, I will be a dragonfly trying to stop a runaway locomotive. If I fly the Evalina, I have a chance to strike the lead bomber. The risk of friendly fire is a secondary concern when the Emperor's palace is shrouded in smoke." Okuyama sighed, a sound of defeat. "The markings have been updated. The Hinomaru is large enough to be seen from a mile away. But remember, Kuroe, in the dark, every Mustang looks like a murderer to our boys." Kuroe climbed into the cockpit. The familiar scent of American leather and high-octane fuel greeted him, providing a strange, grounding comfort amidst the madness. He flipped the switches, the Merlin engine barking to life with its characteristic ferocity. As he taxied out, he saw the young pilots of the interceptor squadrons watching him. There was no mockery left in their eyes, only a desperate, haunting hope that the Silver Ghost could do what their own machines could not. He pushed the throttle forward, and the Evalina screamed down the runway. He didn't climb into the darkness. He plunged into a sky that had been turned into a kaleidoscope of violence. Searchlights stabbed at the clouds like frantic fingers, and the black puffs of anti-aircraft fire blossomed everywhere. At 5,000 feet, Kuroe saw them. The B-29s were moving in long, disciplined streams, their silver bellies glowing red from the fires below. They looked like prehistoric leviathans cruising through a sea of blood. Above them, orbiting like sharks, were the escorting P-51s, the brothers and sisters of the machine Kuroe was now piloting. He banked the Evalina into a steep climb, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the moment he had feared and craved. He was flying the enemy's finest weapon against the enemy's greatest hammer. He felt like a traitor to his blood, yet a fanatic to his craft. As he closed in on the lead element of the bomber stream, a pair of American Mustangs dived out of the moonlit clouds. They had spotted a lone P-51 flying in the wrong direction, wearing the red sun of Japan on its wings. To the American pilots, the Evalina was a blasphemy, a stolen soul that needed to be put down. Kuroe saw the tracers whizzing past his canopy, long fingers of white light reaching out to tear him apart. He dived, feeling the Mustang's airframe groan under the sudden pressure. He was faster than any Japanese plane, but his attackers were just as fast. He was caught in a mirror match where every maneuver he made was countered by a pilot who had been trained in the same school of flight. He pulled into a high G barrel roll, his vision narrowing as the gravity pressed him into the seat. Through the glass of his canopy, he saw the burning city below, a sea of fire that consumed blocks of houses in seconds. The heat was so intense that it created its own weather, massive thermal updrafts that tossed the heavy Mustang around like a leaf in a gale. "Forgive me," Kuroe whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to his ancestors or to the girl painted on the nose of his plane. He lined up his sights on a B-29. The massive bomber filled his windscreen, its 4 engines spitting sparks. He could see the gunners in their plexiglass bubbles, their twin 50 caliber turrets tracking his movement. He was seconds away from pulling the trigger, from using American lead to destroy American steel. But as his finger tightened on the gun button, a sudden realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Even if he downed this bomber, and the 10 behind it, the fire would not stop. The Evalina was a marvel, a miracle of engineering, but it was a drop of water in a volcano. He was a man playing with a stolen toy while his world turned to ash. The American escorts closed in again, their fire raking the air inches from his tail. Kuroe made a split-second decision. He didn't fire. He rolled the Evalina onto her back and dived straight into the smoke of the burning city, disappearing into the gray-black abyss where no pilot, Japanese or American, dared to follow. The morning after the Great Firestorm, Fusa Airfield was buried under a layer of gray, greasy ash that had drifted 20 miles from the incinerated heart of Tokyo. Major Yasuhiko Kuroe stood on the runway, his flight suit smelling of wood smoke and high-octane exhaust. He watched the ground crew frantically hosing down the Evalina. The silver skin of the Mustang was no longer bright. It was stained with soot and the yellowish residue of the incendiary chemicals that had filled the sky. Kuroe walked to the nose of the aircraft. The painted girl, Evalina, was obscured by a streak of oil that looked like a jagged scar across her face. He reached out to wipe it away, but his hand stopped. He noticed a jagged hole in the fairing of the left wing, a single 50 caliber hit from the American escort that had chased him into the smoke. "The radiator is holding, Major," the lead mechanic said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "But the left flap actuator is sluggish, and the spark plugs, they are fouled beyond cleaning. We have tried to scrub them, but the lead deposits from our low-grade fuel are eating the ceramic." Kuroe looked at the engine cowlings, which were being stripped away. The Merlin engine, once a titan of precision, now looked like a dying beast. Without the proprietary American lubricants and the specific 100-octane gasoline it was designed to devour, the internal frictions were beginning to tear it apart from the inside. They were feeding a thoroughbred horse on dried straw and wondering why it began to limp. "Can we fabricate the plugs?" Kuroe asked, knowing the answer before it came. The mechanic shook his head slowly. "Our porcelain is too brittle. Our alloys cannot withstand the heat of the American combustion cycle. We are using parts from a salvaged Hien fighter, but they are like wooden teeth in a tiger's mouth. She will fly, Major, but she is losing her spirit." That afternoon, Kuroe was summoned to a briefing room where the air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and failure. Maps of Japan were spread across the table, heavily marked with red circles representing the path of the B-29 streams. "The Americans are no longer hiding in the clouds," a general barked, slamming a fist onto the table. "They are coming in at 5,000 feet. They are mocking us. Major Kuroe, your reports on the P-51's performance are the only tactical advantage we have. You will lead a specialized interception flight. You will fly the Evalina as a Trojan horse. You will join their formation in the dark, and when they are vulnerable, you will strike from within." Kuroe felt a cold shiver of disgust. "With all respect, General, the Americans are not fools. They have radar. They have identification systems we can barely comprehend. A single Mustang with Japanese markings, even in the dark, is a target for every gunner in the stream. And the engine. She is failing. She cannot sustain combat power for more than 20 minutes. Then 20 minutes is all you have, the general shouted. Every bomber you down is 1,000 Japanese lives saved. Do your duty, Major. Or have you become too fond of your American toy to break it? Kuroe bowed, the silence in the room weighing 10,000 pounds. He walked out into the fading light of the evening. He didn't go to the barracks. He went back to the cell of Lieutenant Strawbridge. The American was sitting in the corner, staring at a small patch of moonlight on the floor. He looked up as Kuroe entered, seeing the despair written on the Major's face. "They're burning us to the ground, aren't they?" Strawbridge asked quietly. "Yes," Kuroe replied. "And they want me to use your Evalina to stop them. They want a miracle from a machine that is running on fumes and prayers." Strawbridge stood up, his joints popping. "She won't do it, Major. Not for long. Those engines are built to tight tolerances. You put that Japanese vinegar fuel in her, and she'll seize up before you reach 20,000 feet. You're going to kill yourself in that cockpit." Kuroe looked at the prisoner, seeing not an enemy, but a reflection of his own lost youth. Perhaps that is the only honorable exit left. To fall with the best thing I have ever known. He left the cell and returned to the hangar. He spent the rest of the night helping the mechanics. He polished the fouled spark plugs with his own silk scarf. He tightened every bolt by hand. He talked to the Evalina as if she could hear him, apologizing for the war, for the fuel, and for the impossible task he was about to demand of her. By 3 a.m, the sirens began their mournful wail again. The radar stations on the coast had picked up a massive pulse, 400 bombers approaching from the Marianas. Kuroe climbed into the cockpit. As he buckled his harness, he noticed a small gift left on the seat by the mechanics, a white headband, a hachimaki, with the kanji for "Certain Victory" written in bold black ink. He tied it around his flight helmet, but he didn't feel like a victor. He felt like a man boarding a silver coffin. He thumbed the starter. The Merlin engine coughed, spat a gout of black flame, and then caught with a ragged, uneven roar. The Evalina was screaming in pain, her cylinders misfiring, but she moved. She taxied out into the night, her landing lights cutting through the ash-filled air. As the wheels left the ground, Kuroe felt a strange lightness. The Mustang was struggling, her vibrations rattling his teeth, but she was still the fastest thing in the Japanese sky. He turned his nose toward the sea, toward the glowing horizon where the next wave of fire was waiting. The ocean below was a vast obsidian mirror, broken only by the pale, phosphorescent crests of the waves. At 15,000 feet, the air was freezing, vibrating with the dissonant hum of a dying engine. Major Yasuhiko Kuroe adjusted his oxygen mask, the rubber smelling of stale sweat and desperate hope. The Evalina was struggling. The mismatched spark plugs were misfiring in a rhythmic, jarring staccato, and the manifold pressure needle danced erratically across the dial. "Stay with me," Kuroe whispered, his gloved hand stroking the cold side of the cockpit. "Just one more hour. Just one more miracle." In the distance, the first flickers of the bomber's stream appeared. They were not just a few planes. They were a river of steel. Hundreds of B-29 superfortresses flying in tight, disciplined boxes. Their navigation lights were off, but the moon caught their polished bellies, turning them into a shimmering, celestial serpent stretching toward the Japanese coast. Kuroe throttled back, trying to match their cruising speed. He approached from the rear and slightly below, hiding in the blind spot of the tail gunners. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a silver Mustang wearing the red sun of Japan, trying to blend into a flock of American eagles. The plan was madness. He was to slide into the formation, identify the lead pathfinder, the plane carrying the specialized radar and the master bombardier, and destroy it before the incendiaries could be released. If he succeeded, The following bombers would be blinded, their fires scattered harmlessly across the countryside, instead of concentrated on the civilian wards of Tokyo. As he drifted closer to the trailing edge of the formation, the sheer scale of the American air power hit him like a physical blow. He could see the individual rivets on the nearest B-29, the V for Victor, painted on its towering tail fin. He could see the waist gunners hunched over their .50 caliber Brownings, their breath frosting in the frigid air. He was so close now that he could hear the overlapping roar of over 1,000 Wright Cyclone engines, a sound like the end of the world. Suddenly, a searchlight from a destroyer far below slashed through the dark, its beam momentarily catching the Evalina. For a heartbeat, the Japanese Hinomaru on his wings glowed a vivid, bloody red against the silver fuselage. A tail gunner in the nearest bomber reacted instantly. A stream of white-hot tracers erupted from the plexiglass bubble, stitching a line of holes across the night sky. "Brake!" Kuroe shouted to himself, slamming the stick to the left. The Evalina responded with a sluggish, agonized roll. The damaged flap actuator groaned, and the engine coughed a gout of black smoke as he pushed a throttle to the firewall. The disguise was gone. The Trojan horse had been unmasked. Two American escort Mustangs hovering high above the stream like guardian angels dived vertically. Their Merlin engines sang a pure, high-pitched predatory note, a sound the Evalina could no longer replicate. They were fresh, fueled by the finest gasoline in the world, and flown by pilots who saw Kuroe not as a man, but as a desecration of their colors. Kuroe hauled the Mustang into a steep climbing turn, his ribs aching under the G-load. He looked through his reflector sight, trying to find the Pathfinder. There it was, a B-29 with a peculiar radar bulge beneath its chin, cruising serenely in the center of the lead box. "Forgive me, Strawbridge," Kuroe muttered, his finger hovering over the gun trigger. He dove toward the Pathfinder, the wind screaming through the bullet holes in his wing. The American escorts were closing fast, their tracers reaching out like glowing fingers to snatch him from the sky. The Evalina shuddered as a burst of .50 caliber rounds clipped her tail. He had the lead bomber in his sights. He could see the daisy cutter incendiaries hanging in the open bomb bay, ready to fall. This was the moment. This was the trade. One silver ghost for 10,000 Japanese lives. He squeezed the trigger. The 6 machine guns in the wings of the Evalina roared, but the sound was wrong. Instead of the steady mechanical hammer he expected, there was a jagged, uneven burst. 2 of the guns jammed instantly, the inferior Japanese ammunition stripping the rifling from the American barrels. Still, he saw his hits. Sparks danced across the wing of the B-29. One engine began to trail a thin ribbon of white smoke. But then, the betrayal of the machine reached its climax. Under the strain of the maximum power dive, the Evalina's engine finally surrendered. A horrific metallic scream echoed through the cockpit, the sound of a connecting rod snapping and punching through the engine block. The windshield was instantly coated in a thick, blinding sheet of hot oil. The roar of the Merlin vanished, replaced by the terrifying whistling silence of a glider. The Evalina was dead in the air, a 3-ton brick of aluminum falling through a sky filled with enemies. The silence inside the cockpit of the Evalina was more terrifying than the roar of 1,000 engines. It was a cold, absolute vacuum that swallowed the world. Major Yasuhiko Kuroe stared through the oil-streaked windshield, his vision blurred by the thick black lubricant of the dying Merlin. He was no longer a pilot, he was a passenger in a falling coffin. The American escort Mustangs, seeing their prey lose power, circled above like silver hawks. They did not fire. Perhaps they saw the black smoke billowing from his cowling and knew the hunt was over. Or perhaps, in some unspoken brotherhood of the air, they wanted to watch the silver ghost meet its end on its own terms. "Flaps," Kuroe grunted, his muscles straining against the stick. The hydraulic pressure was dropping fast. He pumped the manual emergency handle, his breath coming in ragged, frozen gasps. He felt the Evalina shudder as the left flap deployed halfway, then jammed. The plane began to yaw violently to the left, threatening to enter a flat spin that would tear the wings from the fuselage. Below him, the Japanese coastline was a jagged, dark line against the foam of the Pacific. He was too low to bail out safely, and even if he did, the freezing currents of the Sagami Bay would claim him in minutes. His only chance was a stretch of beach near the Choshi Peninsula, a thin ribbon of gray sand illuminated by the pale, indifferent moon. "Stay level," he commanded the machine. "You are an American lady. Show them your grace." He fought the controls with every ounce of his remaining strength. The Mustang was heavy, its laminar flow wings requiring speed that he no longer possessed. Every foot of altitude he traded for distance felt like a drop of his own blood. He looked at the altimeter. 4,000 feet. 3,000. The wind whistled through the bullet holes in the tail, a haunting flute-like sound that seemed to mock his struggle. As he cleared the coastal cliffs, the beach rushed up to meet him. It looked impossibly short, a narrow strip of sand hemmed in by jagged rocks and the skeletal remains of a bombed-out fishing village. Gear up, he decided. A water landing with wheels down would flip the plane and snap his neck. He would have to belly land her. He would have to grind the Evalina's beautiful silver skin into the abrasive salt and sand. He braced his boots against the rudder pedals and pulled his harness so tight it bruised his collarbones. The Evalina crossed the surf line at 120 miles per hour. The sound of the waves was suddenly replaced by a horrific, screeching roar as the metal belly of the fighter struck the wet sand. The impact slammed Kuroe's head against the armored headrest. Sparks erupted from beneath the wings, a cascading fountain of fire that lit up the beach like a celebratory flare. The Mustang skidded, tilting precariously as the left wingtip dug into a dune. The plane spun 360 degrees, a violent, bone-jarring carousel that seemed to last an eternity. Then there was stillness. The only sound was the ticking of hot metal cooling in the night air and the rhythmic, eternal crash of the tide. Kuroe sat in the cockpit, his forehead resting against the instrument panel. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, dripping onto the glass of the manifold pressure gauge. He fumbled with the canopy release. It was jammed by the twisted frame of the fuselage. He kicked at the plexiglass, his boots echoing hollowly, until the panel shattered. He crawled out onto the wing, his legs shaking so violently he could barely stand. He slid down to the sand and collapsed, looking back at his prize. The Evalina lay broken on the shore. Her propeller was twisted into grotesque metal pretzels. Her belly was torn open, exposing the intricate, delicate plumbing of her cooling system. The girl on the nose was gone, scraped away by the friction of the landing. Kuroe reached out and touched the tail fin. The large red Hinomaru was scarred and peeling. "It is over," he whispered to the wreckage. High above, the drone of the B-29 stream continued, unabated. The Pathfinder he had hit was gone, but 10 others had taken its place. The sky to the north began to glow with that familiar, sickly orange light as the incendiaries found their mark on the suburbs of Tokyo. The Evalina had given him everything she had. She had flown on vinegar fuel, she had endured mismatched parts, and she had carried him through a wall of fire. But in the end, she was just a machine, and he was just a man. Neither of them could change the orbit of a falling empire. As the first light of dawn began to gray the eastern horizon, Kuroe saw a group of Japanese coastal guards approaching with fixed bayonets. They looked terrified, unsure if the silver wreckage belonged to a god or a demon. Kuroe did not reach for his pistol. He simply sat in the sand, watching the smoke of his burning capital rise into the morning sky, and mourned for the lady who had died to save him from a war he had already lost. August of 1945 arrived not with a breeze, but with a blinding, terrifying light that seemed to swallow the very horizon. Major Yasuhiko Kuroe stood in the ruins of the Fusa airfield, his arm in a sling from the beach landing, watching a sky that no longer belonged to Japan. The news of the new sun over Hiroshima had reached them in whispered, terrified fragments. It was a weapon that made the technological marvel of the Mustang look like a primitive spear. Kuroe walked past the charred remains of his hangar. The Evalina had been hauled back from the beach, but she was a skeleton now. Mechanics had stripped her for anything that could be repurposed: wires, glass, even the leather from the seat. She sat on wooden blocks, her silver nose pointing toward a sky she would never touch again. The war of machines had ended with a war of atoms, and the warrior's code had been vaporized in a single heartbeat. He made his way to the detention block. The guards were gone, their rifles leaned against the walls as they huddled around a radio, listening to the Emperor's voice, a voice they had never heard before, speaking of enduring the unendurable. Kuroe unlocked the door to Lieutenant Strawbridge's cell. The American was standing by the small window, watching the smoke of a distant fire. He didn't turn when the door opened. "It is over, Strawbridge," Kuroe said, his voice a dry rasp. "Your people have brought the sun down to earth. My Emperor has asked us to lay down our arms." Strawbridge turned slowly. He looked older, his face gaunt, but his eyes were clear. He looked at Kuroe's bandaged arm and the tattered uniform. "Did you save them, Major? That night in the fire?" Kuroe looked at his boots. "I saved no one. I broke your lady on a beach for a drop of water in a burning forest. We were both fools to think a single wing could change the fate of millions." The American stepped forward, reaching out a hand, then hesitated. The gulf between them was still filled with the ghosts of 1,000 fallen pilots. "She wasn't just a wing, Kuroe. She was a bridge. You flew her, and for a moment, you saw the world through our eyes. And I sat here, and I saw the world through yours." "A bridge made of bayonets," Kuroe murmured. He pulled a small object from his pocket, the brass data plate from the Evalina's cockpit, the one he had unscrewed before the scavengers could take it. He pressed it into Strawbridge's palm. "Take this. Tell them she died with honor. Tell them she was a samurai in silver skin." Outside, the sirens began a long, steady wail, not for an attack, but for the end of an era. The two men stood in the silence of the cell, two enemies bound by a machine that had outlasted their empires. The official surrender was signed on the deck of a massive American battleship, but for Major Yasuhiko Kuroe, the war ended on the tarmac of a ruined airfield. A few weeks after the Emperor's broadcast, a flight of American C-47 transports touched down at Fusa to collect the prisoners of war and evaluate what remained of the Japanese air power. Among the arriving Americans was a high-ranking colonel from the Technical Intelligence Wing. He walked through the hangars with a clipboard, his face a mask of professional curiosity, until he stopped dead in front of the skeletal remains of the Evalina. "My God," the colonel whispered, tracing the scarred Hinomaru on the wing. "One of ours. How did she end up here?" Kuroe stood nearby, dressed in a clean but frayed uniform, his sword handed over to a junior officer an hour before. He watched as Lieutenant Strawbridge stepped out of the transport plane, his eyes blinking against the bright afternoon sun. The American pilot walked straight to the wreckage, ignoring the guards and the officers. He stood by the cockpit for a long time, his hand resting on the cold, hollow frame. "She flew, Colonel," Strawbridge said, his voice carrying across the quiet airfield. "She flew for the enemy, and she flew for us. She was the best thing in this sky." Kuroe approached slowly, nodding to the American pilot. There were no salutes, only a weary, mutual recognition. They were the last of a breed, men who had lived in the clouds while the world below tore itself apart. The Americans began the process of hauling the Evalina away. She wouldn't be repaired. She was destined for a scrap heap, or perhaps a museum shelf, a curiosity of a war that had grown too large for individual heroisms. As the crane lifted the fuselage, the silver skin caught the light of the setting sun one last time, flashing with a ghostly, defiant brilliance. "What will you do now, Major?" Strawbridge asked, his gear packed and ready for the flight to Ohio. Kuroe looked at the empty space where the hangar had once stood. "I will learn to live on the ground. I will tell the stories of the men who didn't come home. And I will remember the smell of your Evalina's engine, the smell of a future I wasn't ready to see." They shook hands, a brief, firm grip that bridged two worlds. Strawbridge boarded the transport, and as the engines roared to life, Kuroe stood on the runway, his feet planted firmly in the dust of his defeated country. He watched the American planes rise, their silver wings disappearing into the vast, indifferent blue. The silver ghost was gone. The war was a memory. But as Yasuhiko Kuroe walked away from the airfield, he still felt the phantom vibration of the Merlin engine in his bones. A reminder that for one brief, impossible moment, he had touched the lightning.